Welcome, everyone, and thanks, Richard, so much for the great introduction. I will pass over to our panelists now for a quick intro before we move into a very interesting conversation. Why don't we start with you?
Hello, my name's Dawd Haque. I work in market initiatives, regulatory transformation and strategy for Deutsche Bank. My main activity is advising the business globally on new trades, new products and new businesses, in particular around the cross-border implications of those businesses. Externally, I am a member of IST 12, the ISO Committee for UK Financial Services, as well as TC 68 AG5 on digital assets. Member of the DSB ANA Product Committee, currently rolling out the new product taxonomy, the UPI. DCC Steering Committee globally, so that's a trade repository, which do all systemic risk reporting. I'm also a member of the GLI-FIGI, which is the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, that own the LEI network. Apart from that, I also work on many different market initiatives and industry initiatives around standardization and new initiatives around working on regulatory change.
Hello everyone, my name's Tim Ward. I've spent the last 20 years in financial services and in particular applying technology to solve compliance challenges. I currently work at Cube Global, who specialise in solutions for providing automated regulatory intelligence.
Hello, my name is Philippa Young. I work at Citibank in the regulations management team, which is part of compliance. And what we do is basically we look at those regulations that impact Citi as a financial services institution. And then once we've ingested that information, we pass it on to the right people who need to analyse it. And then we think about how it needs to be recorded in our inventory.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Vikramaditya. I'm a managing director at Bank of New York Mellon. I've got responsibility for the leadership and execution of a variety of strategic and regulatory change programs across the global enterprise. And specifically with respect to the topic that we have today, I've spent the last sort of more than a decade delivering a variety of regulation across global businesses. And that has included regulation out of the US like Dodd-Frank-Volcker, Europe, which is AIFMD, EMIR, MiFID II, Brexit, etc., as well as APAC regulations across various jurisdictions.
Thanks, everyone. And for myself, I think having been in the regulatory space at the Bank of England for a lot of years before moving to the Reserve Bank now, again in this similar space, I think I'm really excited, as you must all be, for a very invigorating conversation. So I guess to start off, I'd be very keen to hear your perspectives on what new areas of regulatory changes do you see coming. Why don't we start off with you, Dawd?
Thank you. So one of my roles is to future-proof my organisation around regulatory change, understand what's on our horizon very early on in the process, and advocate for sympathetic rules to the way we do business today. So in that guise, I've been very fortunate to work with many of our regulators on the development of new regulations. Some of the things we're seeing at the moment are the finalisation of rules which started just after 2008. So at the moment we're working on the CPM IOSCO standards, global standards for cross-border reporting rules, and the data dictionaries and the critical data element data dictionary, the UPI, UTI, in the global use of those. And what that's really doing is driving home the need for definitions, globally accepted definitions on fundamental data elements that we all use in all financial firms, how that transfer of data is going from the firm into middleware and then onto the regulators. So we're also adopting things like the ISO 20022 messaging formats. Everything is being uploaded into ISO standards so that we have an ability to benchmark what good looks like, what it means. So that's one area where we're seeing a great deal of change. And I'm going to see that rolled out across everything from currently it's only in reporting, but I'm currently working on digital assets and bringing those standards into that area. And we're going to be rolling that out into AI in the future as well, as we were speaking on at a conference earlier today. Beyond that, we're seeing other developments in tax. So after the pandemic, a lot of regulatory authorities, or more importantly, a lot of central banks are looking to raise additional funds. And I think the financial transaction tax is going to raise its head again in the near future. There's already been some discussions in Europe on that, and I think we'll see a keenness to adopt that now as a way of transferring some of the value back out of the markets, back into real household incomes. And beyond that, we're also seeing an extension of what has been going on for a while is know your client, the KYC, financial crime. There's going to be a lot more ability to transfer data, digital IDs, being able to identify an individual not just within a jurisdiction but across jurisdictions, and that's the place I'm seeing change.
It's a very interesting perspective. I guess, Philippa, now sort of coming to you to talk more about the corporate sustainability and diligence in that, and sometimes how firms might not be aware that certain restrictions or regulations or that they fall under, and how to sort of keep abreast of that.
Yeah, so obviously if we talk about new regulations, we can't help but talk about ESG. And I wanted to talk about the European Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Now, I'm quite surprised that my false teeth didn't fly out there, because to say due diligence directive is quite difficult. But essentially, there are two elements to that. So you would need to create an action plan which aligns with the intentions of the Paris Agreement, so keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. And then the second element of this proposal is to do due diligence on your third parties, so suppliers and distributors, as well as your business operations in terms of matters of environmental and social issues. So you'll need to look at, so for example, it's looking at things like child labour, human slavery, pollution. And so if you find this in some of your business relationships, addressing those, remediating those. So there was some discussion about whether financial institutions should even be covered by this. Now, it looks like it's very likely that banks will. And in terms of the scope, it looks like it would apply to EU entities that have more than 250 employees, if there's turnover of more than 40 million in the EU. But also, it's going to capture non-EU entities as well. If you have global turnover of more than 150 million, and more than 40 of which is in the EU. So pretty wide-ranging. And in terms of penalties, it looks like this will invoke, the penalties are around 5% of global turnover. And very interestingly, for directors that are included in scope firms, if they've got a firm that has more than 1,000 employees, they will be responsible for this climate action plan. So what about the UK? Well, the UK has said they don't intend to replicate that particular directive because we have existing legislation. But if you look at the Modern Slavery Act, for example, which requires companies with a turnover of over 36 million in the UK, they need to produce a statement which effectively talks about the steps they've taken to erase human slavery, both in their business operations but also in their third-party supplier arrangements as well. But it doesn't really have very strong teeth. So it seems to me the worst that can happen is that the Secretary of State can require you by injunction to issue a statement if you're not already doing so. So it's clearly a piece of legislation that is ripe for reform, and we saw this coming out of the 2022 Queen's speech, and so there is a proposed draft bill out there which includes things like financial penalties if you make misleading statements in your modern slavery statement. However, it doesn't seem to have gone anywhere, so it'd be interesting to know if people know more about what's happening with that particular piece of legislation. And then very briefly, I wanted to talk about corporate sustainability disclosures, which is obviously a really interesting topic. So effectively, if you're a UK entity and you're already subject to mandatory TCFD reporting, then don't get comfortable with that, because it's very likely that you're going to have to change to ISB standards. And that's not just for climate, that's also for sustainability. We've seen this already with the FCA consultation on SDR for asset managers, but I think the area where it's most likely going to be taken by surprise is banks. Banks that are now caught by TCFD mandatory reporting as a result of changes to the Companies Act. They'll be grappling with that at the moment. They need to be prepared for these standards to change further. Now, in the EU, we would look at CSRD. I'm so tempted to say CSDR. So that particular regulation for EU banks that are caught by that, they'll need to think about sustainability reporting. They'll also, and there are standards for that being developed, so this is EFRAG standards, it's different from ISSB, different from TCFD. They will need to be adhered to. And also there's a concept of value chain reporting as well. So looking at ESG matters in your direct and indirect business relationships. So a lot of work that will need to be done to comply with that.
If I may just add a thought there, ESG, sustainability, I think digital, all of those are, of course, items on the horizon. But there's another one which possibly might stem from a lot of the market events that we have seen in the first quarter of this year, which is with respect to, shadow banks, as they're called. And we've already seen over the years lots of regulatory action with respect to money market mutual funds, as an example. But there might be more that might come just as part of broader strengthening of the regulatory framework.
It's a very interesting angle as well. I guess with all of these changes that, I'm sure your businesses, you anticipate coming in, looking a bit more towards the governance and compliance side, how do you see these changes being prioritized, and how do you think this will, adapting to these changes will impact your teams and, that their productivity, essentially?
Yeah, so I think this whole aspect in terms of how does one approach regulatory changes is quite interesting, and something which I would say financial institutions in particular have been grappling with for the last now 15 years post the credit crisis of 2008. And I would say there are sort of 2 or 3 core pillars in terms of how one approaches this. I think the first real aspect is ownership. I think it's really fundamentally important in any organization to have clear ownership for the regulation that is coming through. And ideally, if you can have a single place where that ownership resides across the various regulations that are coming through, then even better. Because then that enables a more holistic approach to be taken that cuts across regulations and helps to optimize the definition and the articulation of the operating models. But even if it's not one place, having very clear ownership is a sort of core starting point. And I think the next aspect to that, which links into how you would look to prioritize and how we look to manage the impact of that in terms of the impact on people and the teams and resources, is a lot about optimizing that entire approach with how regulatory change itself is implemented into the organization. And that has, again, you would say some sub-pillars to it. The first is having early visibility. I mean, you can really effectively do implementation, prioritization if you know well in advance that something is coming. So horizon scanning is very important. Having early visibility is important. Having strong engagement between the horizon scanning team and the business that is expected to finally implement the regulation into their business processes is key. And that early visibility helps the prioritization process. And a great example of that is if you get a regulation that, if you get to know of a regulation that is, let's say, 4 months away in terms of go live, you really have no choice from a prioritization perspective. You just have to do it, right? It sort of trumps everything else, and you just go and do that at the cost of, keeping aside all of the other initiatives that were in play. So prioritization is really only possible if there is early visibility. And linked to that is having the impact assessment also done in a sensible and meaningful way. So if you, again, have a good understanding of the impacts or the likely impacts of the regulation, that enables sensible prioritization to take place. That enables sensible resource allocation to take place. And the last pillar, I would say, is how do you approach the definition of the operating models? Do not just tick the box, right? It's a very sort of simple approach to execution of regulatory change, which says, I have to do this, and I will comply. I think there is a broader opportunity there, which is, yes, one has to comply, but is there an opportunity there to enhance one's client proposition? Is there an opportunity there to impact positively what we are doing for clients? And or is there an opportunity there to improve our operational efficiency? So if one thinks about change in a more generic way and not just saying, oh, I have a regulation and I have a compliance requirement, but if you think about it more generically, you can take that into saying, let's define an optimal operating model and then execute that into the business. And that enables resources to also be optimized as you execute and deliver that. So I would just say that there are some 3 key pillars. Ownership is key. The approach to regulatory change, especially in terms of early visibility, is key and enabling prioritization. And the last is how you think about the delivery of regulatory change and the operating models that encompass that. Those 3 key pillars, I think, are what can enable this to be driven very efficiently through any firm.
Thanks, Vikram. And I think as regulators, we also like to think that we don't want you to approach it as a tick box exercise, but more as a way, how do we add value into the process, really? And I guess it would be interesting to hear from a technology industry perspective how you approach it. But just a quick reminder to the audience before we move to Tim is that the Brella app is open for questions. We have had some questions coming in, interesting ones, but I'm sure if you have more to ask, feel free to put it on there and we'll cover it during the last segment. So yes, Tim, very keen to hear what you sort of think of it from a technology perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely agree that the idea is to try and be in a position where you can be proactive rather than reactive, so that you can seize and you actually have time to implement some of those opportunities. So how can technology help? Well, firstly, we can get all of the rules and regulations into a single place and allow firms to build an accurate, up-to-date, real-time profile of the organization from a regulatory point of view. And then once that is in place, we can also aggregate and classify automatically any regulatory changes or issuances by regulatory organizations that might be relevant. Just before this session, I had a quick look, and there's been over 1 million different issuances around the world in the last 12 months. And if you were looking to attempt to read all of those, it would take a 50-person team a year just to read them, not necessarily interpret them or action them. So clearly technology needs to be put to work to be able to automate that process and surface the right information to the right people at the right time. I think also it's a question of that we alluded to it in the first question, very detailed information at the regulation level that has to then be interpreted and then propagated through the rest of the organisation, so that that information is actionable and is actually being used to make key business decisions.
Can I just so as we see the velocity of regulatory change increasing, and it has, quite frankly, we thought 2008 was a big deal, but then came 2014, then came 2017, then 18, then 20, then 22, 23, now a massive concatenation of regulatory change in 24. What we need is a way to aggregate regulatory change and find those areas where there are synergies, and we can put the same technology team to work on multiple requirements at the same time, rather than siloing everybody. This is your regulatory change, you need to do this and deliver it by that time. This is your portfolio of regulatory change, these are the themes, and this is all on your area, and you need to find a way of interleaving these to create these solutions all at the same time. And I think that parallel approach to build is where we have to get to in order to meet all of these disparate regulatory requirements at the same time.
Dawd, that's only possible, isn't it, when you've got that global holistic view of all of your controls, procedures and activity, but you can see the cross-correlation between all of those things and the multiple obligations. And I think that's one of the biggest opportunities for efficiency, to be able to eliminate duplicative kind of processes and know when they need to be updated.
Thanks, Tim. I guess going just off from that, you mentioned about the opportunities coming out of that, but how do you sort of foresee the challenges as well with all of these regulatory changes that's coming up?
I mean, we've taught one of the primary challenges is the sheer volume and velocity of the change. It's a complex problem, but it's a known problem, and it's also, we know it's going to continue into the next 5 or 10 years. Today, we've in the previous session, there's obviously calls for regulators where possible to work with each other to harmonise regulations or reporting requirements. The reality is, whilst we may wish for that to happen and want that to happen, it's likely that they still will be diverged complex requirements around the world for years to come. So we know what the problem is. That's the good news. I think the challenge that firms have is that, in addition to the regulatory change, their own organisations are changing as well rapidly. And so I think the answer really is to get a consolidated, systematic process in place, making full use of technology, but also utilising internal expertise, making the best use of what the vendors have to offer and really understanding what vendors have to offer, and then linking that with all of the compliance expertise within the organisations. And I think technology has the ability to automate and eliminate those manual processes, and hopefully that frees up those resources to go and do those higher value activities.
Vikram, I'd like to add.
Yes, thanks. And I sort of fully agree, Tim, with what you're saying and what Dawd said earlier. So a couple of sort of thoughts there. One, regulatory change has become a bit of a constant, right? So it's not going away. And I think businesses need to sort of configure themselves in a way that they can deliver this on a sustainable basis. And I think the other aspect is about what I would call tooling. And you can call them technology solutions, etc. But it is about ensuring that the organization is using appropriate tools to deliver this on a sustainable basis. And one of the challenges that I have sort of faced in the past is, yes, there are tools available, but they're very fragmented. So there is a large ecosystem out there, but those tools don't talk to each other. They don't talk to the systems in the bank, right? And it is a huge challenge to bring it all together in an integrated way. And which leads me to the third point there, which is around data. Ultimately, a lot of what you're doing in regulation is about data, as is in business as well. And again, having systems that don't always talk to each other makes data an even bigger challenge. But again, those are the aspects to consider, and those are some of the challenges that regulatory change imposes on firms.
So how do you then, it sounds like we always have to sort of be mindful of what's coming up on the horizon and be mindful of where regulation can lead. So maybe what are some of the sort of effective approaches to this, awareness or effective horizon scanning that your businesses follow? Philippa, maybe can I bring you into the conversation for this?
I suppose sort of some of my thoughts about reg change are around. Often what happens is reg change is done in a silo. So a particular development comes in and people think, oh, it ostensibly relates to this in this particular business, and they go ahead and implement, and another business has not thought it applies, and they sort of have to be coaxed to understand that it does apply to them, and then they get on board. But obviously a lot of time and effort is spent in that, and that I think is to do with how, particularly in big organisations, reg change is implemented. It's often implemented business by business. It's quite rare to have working groups where people are talking to each other, sharing shared experience of implementation. So I think, ideally we'd be setting up more cross-business working groups when we're looking at reg change, and also, never assuming. So if you look at something like the SDR consultation from the FCA, obviously, ostensibly, looks like it's for asset managers, but there is in that also a general rule that applies to all regulated firms that are saying something in their products and services about sustainability. So that could easily be a miss, because if you just assume, ESG handbook, I don't have to worry about that. Well, you do.
So important to sort of be mindful of that. And I guess, Dawd, bringing you in now, how do you sort of look at it as like the life cycle of regulation in this?
So it's for my role, it's key that I understand how the regulator is thinking and what they want to achieve as an outcome from regulatory change. So the regulatory life cycle for me starts at going to conferences, listening to regulators talking about what they want to achieve and what the outcomes are going to be. So often things, for example, if we bring this back to the FCA, it will be a market watch, or it will be going to a conference and hearing the FCA, the Bank of England, actually talk. Or I'm very fortunate, I'm a member of multiple committees at the Bank of England, where the FCA and the Bank of England get together with certain firms and we'll talk through what they're seeing at the moment in the market, what they want to achieve from new data requests. And so I can internalize that, understand what we're doing ourselves, and have an idea prior to a draft paper coming out of what they want to achieve from those regulations. And hopefully I can advise them or provide some feedback on the impact that will have on firms. Then going forwards, so Tim was very right. So 1 million documents were published last year. Okay, so a task I've had for years and years across multiple very large IBs is to read those documents. So I sit there and look at websites, pull down documents, read them page per page, hundreds of pages, write notes, and then put an Excel spreadsheet together, put dots on it with preliminary dates, and then go back and back on those websites and then find finalized dates and discuss with our businesses how that will impact. Tim has a tool, other tools are available, which do horizon scanning for us, which could make me redundant. But thankfully it won't, because it will augment my role rather than replace me, I hope.
Plus, it'd allow you to sit on another. It'd allow you to sit on another 200 regulatory committees, Dawd. So, yeah, I mean, I think I say to people, there's a lot of inertia, I think, in compliance technology, and it's understandable inertia because it's a high risk endeavour, and there's some comfort to be had in reading some of those articles, and there's lots of side benefits in doing so. But I would say that at least technology, let technology show you where to start and help prioritize what you do read. And I think it can certainly help classify, and the use of artificial intelligence over the last couple of years has really accelerated, become much more accurate, much more trustworthy, and it does an amazing job at classifying and surfacing what you might find relevant. And I'd just like to lead on, going to events, I think like this is crucial. I think really good return on investment is reading speeches from regulators. That's really where the nub of the interpretation and the guidance is happening. The rule will lay out in black and white what the principle or the rule is, but it's all about the interpretation. And that paragraph, buried somewhere within those million issuances, could literally save the company hundreds of thousands or millions in implementing in accordance with the expectation of the regulator at the time. Consumer duty is a classic example where firms are still wrestling with what is a good outcome for a consumer, what does that mean in terms of actual processes, and I think that interpretation is available in those speeches and in those guidances.
One last thing. So the challenge, and Vikram said this earlier actually, isn't necessarily, well, there's loads of challenges in that whole front to back. One is obviously the consumption of all these regulatory texts. Second is the translation of those. But the third one is the overlay to the business that we actually do, which is, as Tim said, an evolving business anyway. So it is that mapping to what we actually do, which is key. And therein lies the challenge, but also the opportunity, because that's where the synergies can come, and that's how we can create some value from this front to back process.
I completely agree, and I think as we sort of touched upon, that it kind of came out from all of your sort of discussions, some top tips on how to sort of manage these regulatory changes and to sort of be aware of them, and effective way as well to prioritize and look forward. So I guess with that in mind, and in the interest of time, thanks again for a wonderful discussion, but we will move on to the Q&A. So we have got some questions here. So I'll start with the first one. So do regulators have a role to play in addressing irresponsible reporting by the media? I guess that's more so for the regulatory perspective, and I'm probably going to leave that one just because the panels might not be in the right place to answer to that. But in terms of future challenges, they said, how do you sort of foresee in your own business space future regulatory challenges, and what might that look like in your own field?
I can speak from a vendor perspective in terms of what we see firms wrestling with, and I think it's the complex. Everyone knows that they'd like to implement sort of more technology within this space, and if they could click their fingers and have this all working on Monday morning, they would do. And so I think the challenge, the future challenge is really how to implement the improvement while still meeting all of your current obligations and rolling out that change within the organization. And so I see large firms kind of counter that or overcome that challenge by being realistic in the projects that they choose to take on initially, and instead of trying to revamp the entire regulatory change program and stack, pick an individual business unit, an individual product, an individual country, get the solution embedded, get feedback within the organization, demonstrate success and return on investment, and then let that kind of grow. So sometimes we do see top-down strategic projects that replace the entire technology stack, but much more often it's a case of choosing an individual regulation or business unit or team, starting slowly, demonstrating success, getting feedback from within the organization of what's working and what's not working, and addressing any challenges head on, and then let that kind of success expand.
It's quite an interesting perspective, Vikram.
I
did
just wanted to say we have covered actually in earlier in the discussion a lot of the regulations that are coming up, and those are obviously going to impact businesses. And one of the key goals we have is to see how those regulations can be delivered effectively in a cohesive, integrated way.
For me, it is as we move to regulators are currently working on a lot better and closer communication with each other. So cross-border harmonization, communication. Global firms have always been siloed by region, which can create different outcomes in different regions. So firms are going to have to review how they report globally and come to some new decisions on harmonization internally, as well as looking at harmonized rules externally. The second issue is resourcing. So there is a small pool of experienced resource, and there's a large requirement for it. So everyone's chasing a few people, and that's just going to get worse.
That is a definitely interesting spin to the conversation. Well, I guess one other question that has come in, which is a bit open, so maybe more to see how you sort of approach it, is what do you want to see more of from this industry?
So when you say this industry,
So
is that the vendors?
Yeah, so I think what they mean is with how you maybe want to see more of working together with the regulators and more in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a couple of comments today around, can the regulators be comfortable with promoting or at least acknowledging which vendors have solutions in particular spaces. And I kind of totally understand why you never get an endorsement from a regulator, for example, and I don't really expect that to change either. I think the answer, though, is the regulators do publish good practice and bad examples of good practice and bad practice that I think lots of firms find really useful. I think if they were to name check vendors on the good practice side and say, we saw this, it was working really well, it seemed an effective control, etc., perhaps this was part of the solution stack that sort of enabled that. Maybe that would be useful. But I'd encourage, first of all, I think from a vendor perspective, we've got to make sure that our offerings are clear, reliable, they're accurate, that we're describing their capabilities in plain language. That's certainly something that the vendors can do. I think something that the financial institutions can do is share how those implementations are going, what problems are they solving, maybe not publicly, but within sort of forums like this, so that everyone starts to feel more comfortable with applying technology to some of these solutions, problems.
I mean, what I would say as a wish list is that, tools which are there actually look at it on a cross-border, cross-jurisdiction basis. I mean, one of the biggest challenges any, global financial institution faces is that for every market in which they operate, they end up with local regulatory solutions. How do we get out of that? And, are there providers there who can actually address the requirement across all of those markets rather than having 25 solutions in 25 markets?
Just quickly then, so vendor onboarding for me is extremely difficult, especially smaller vendors that are bespoke and maybe relatively new. It can take a year plus. We have a lot of regulatory oversight on new vendors in high risk areas such as financial services. I think regulators could help in that space, sandboxing those new vendors, giving them some sort of certification to allow them to shortcut our approaches so that they don't have to go through such arduous approaches, will allow some of these newer, innovative market participants to onboard large investment firms.
Thank you. I think that was a very, broad and nice perspective on how or what you need from the industry, not just from the regulatory side, but products and vendors side as well. So I guess with that, I'd love to, thank you all for a very interesting conversation, and thank you all to the audience as well for, for your questions and for being with us and coming to the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.